Okay, guys, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Steinberg, who's the Director of Training at Cognitive Behavioral Consultants of Westchester, our group practice here in White Plains. She oversees postdoc training, and she oversees the larger staff keep up with our evidence-based treatment and practice with outside speakers coming in. Perry gave a talk recently. Thank you again, Perry, for that. So she's going to be talking today about a very important topic, of course, which is family therapy component of DBT, which is not often addressed in a lot of workshops, and I think she's really exceptionally gifted in this area, and I want to have her give some of her teaching points. So come on up, Jen.
So I'm very excited to be here to talk about conducting family therapy in DBT and just conducting DBT with parents and families, principles, procedures, and pitfalls. So today I'm going to focus on two main areas in my talk, talking about the functions of family therapy in terms of the larger functions in comprehensive DBT, as well as the targets of family therapy in DBT, which include orientation and commitment, teaching validation, and conducting family behavioral analyses. So on this slide, I've listed the functions of the comprehensive DBT program, which include improving motivation to change, enhancing capabilities, ensuring skills generalization, structuring the environment to support clients and therapists, and improving therapist motivation and capabilities. The second, third, and fourth functions of comprehensive DBT are also functions of family therapy. So I'd like you to think about this as I go through my talk and the ways in which this specific modality can address that. So first, speaking about the targets of family therapy, orientation in all forms of therapy is really critical. So at the outset of DBT, we want to increase parents' understanding of teens' emotional vulnerability, their skills deficits, the biosocial theory, and DBT targets and the specific ways in which the various modes of DBT address those targets. We also want to increase their understanding of risk factors. We want to obtain commitment. We want to reduce behaviors that are linked to the teenager's life-threatening behaviors, and of course this is a very high priority in DBT. And through family therapy sessions and through behavioral chain analyses, which I'll speak about later, we can really understand if a behavior, for example, suicidal ideation, is operant, meaning it's under the control of the consequences, such as when a teenager will express suicidal ideation, are they more likely to get help from the environment? Is it respondent, meaning automatically elicited by an event or some sort of physical or emotional pain, or is it both? And we don't want to assume it's one or the other, we really want to assess this. We also want to target the reduction of events linked to teen and family therapy interfering behaviors. So for example, is there decreased therapy engagement when the teenager is functioning at a higher level? We want to reduce behaviors or events linked to the teenager's quality of life interfering behaviors. So for a teenager who has an alcohol abuse problem, we want to, for example, decrease access to alcohol in the home. And we want to increase teen and family behavioral skills as they relate to these targets. So encouraging effective communication, validation, problem solving, the application of behavioral principles and contingencies. And we want to help in the family therapy sessions and when we cope ahead for family therapy sessions for family members to use the distress tolerance skills in vivo. And we want to increase everybody's use of dialectical thinking and dialectical strategies. So for example, balancing looseness and strictness. So when we're doing orientation, we also want to clarify the need with family members and orient them to DBT. So you're going to review, of course, the 5 problem areas. And you want to obtain family members' perspectives on which of those apply to the teenagers and often to themselves. You want to specifically describe how the treatment addresses those problem areas via the DBT modes. So for example, capabilities are enhanced through multifamily skills group and family therapy. Skills generalization is enhanced through coaching and family therapy, and so on. You also want to invite concerns about treatment and whether they think the treatment will be useful. And I'll speak to more of that in a moment. So we want to increase youth and parents' investment in treatment. We really want to acknowledge the effort and strengths of the parents, the family, and the youth, how hard they are trying on behalf of the teenager, and the teenager's strengths and their resiliency that's going to help them to build a life worth living. It's critical that we identify attitudes about prior treatment experiences. So how do you feel about your child's coming to treatment here? What are your expectations? How do you feel about participating in treatment yourself? What are your specific concerns, for example, about participating in the multifamily skills group? I'm often more concerned if a teenager has no concerns about that. Really? You want to spend 2 hours with your parents every week in this group? So you really want to start to also ask them, what are their worries? Do they have concerns, for example, about confidentiality, or that other group members' problems will be more serious than their own? So often as providers, we'll problem solve concrete obstacles to care, things like child care, finances, and transportation. But we sometimes neglect clarifying needs and attending to parents' attitudes about treatment. So research shows that some parents are reluctant to engage in treatment due to fears of stigma and adverse consequences. So this could be feeling disrespected by providers, or in some cases, parents may have had the experience of having ACS or Child Protective Services called by a provider, perhaps in an impulsive way. And it may be difficult for them to bring this up to you, so you really want to be sensitive to this and even mind read their concerns, even if they don't bring them up themselves. So to reduce family members' anxiety, it's critical to describe the roles of the providers, the treatment program, and the family members in the process at the outset of treatment. Also, we want to mindfully use the term "we" when referring to our roles and the shared goal of helping the teenager. So this really is a collaborative treatment. So you want to use the word "we" to signify that and get them to be actively involved. Ideally, in fact, you want to have the teenager explain how the treatment is going to be relevant to him or her and have them invite their parents to participate. This really helps to increase their own commitment as they describe it to their parents. You want to be sure to address the parameters of confidentiality for outpatient treatment at the outset. So this in and of itself is an early example of a dialectic. So when the therapist is speaking to the family, they want to highlight the importance of confidentiality to the therapeutic relationship, and at the same time, validate the parents' understandable anxiety that they may not be informed of every behavior, every instance of suicidal ideation, self-harm urges or behavior in this domain. You're going to explain the specific way in DBT that we monitor these self-harm urges and behavior and suicidal behavior, and also explain your expertise in assessing these behaviors and assessing risk. You explain to the parent that if you were to tell them of each incident of these types of behavior or respond to their questions about this, that the teenager would actually be less likely to disclose. And then you want to present the synthesis of these two ideas, that suicidal ideation and behavior and non-suicidal self-injury is, of course, incredibly serious, and explain that you're going to maintain the teenager's confidence unless there is an indication of imminent threat to life, either suicidal or homicidal, or a suspicion of child abuse or neglect. So the therapist in this latter case would explain that it's actually a legal mandate in New York State, for example, that confidentiality be breached by informing the state's child protection hotline in order to maintain the safety of the child. But you want to really familiarize yourself with the laws in each state and with your institution's specific policies around this issue. And of course, You want to employ all the commitment strategies that you do in individual therapy with family therapy. I'm not going to go through these for the sake of time, but it's just important to highlight again how critical this is for family therapy and individual therapy, and it's critical to outcome. So now I'll talk about the nuts and bolts of family therapy sessions. So how do we include families? We want to divide individual therapy sessions in half. If you can schedule a double session, so often this would be a 90-minute session. It's important to make sure you have enough time to address the goals of the family therapy session. You want to coach and prepare the adolescent ahead of time. So what skills are you going to use if your distress level rises? Are you going to self-soothe? Use deep breathing? Are you going to mindfully ask for a timeout so that you can leave the room and get your emotions regulated and return? You also want to, if they haven't yet learned this in skills training group, as other people have alluded to, teach them validation skills before you initiate any problem solving. Now this can be difficult because family members are coming because they want you to solve problems. So it's worth taking the time though and explaining to them and orienting to them why this is so important. And then last but not least, in the family sessions, you can conduct behavioral and solution analysis. Okay, on this slide, we have the picture where we're talking about how we do the dance of DBT. And the skilled family therapist and the skilled DBT therapist is using their mindfulness skills to balance validation and acceptance-oriented strategies with change-oriented strategies such as problem solving. So in this dance, we're constantly moving between these two polarities and balancing environmental intervention, for example, structuring the environment, with consulting to the patient and getting them to play an active role in changing their behavior and changing their life. So before I discuss validation, I want to take a moment to highlight the cycle of invalidation to understand why it's so important to teach validation before you engage in problem solving. So people who have a predisposition to emotional vulnerability are at chronically elevated levels of emotional arousal, which leads them to inaccurately express their emotions, and it leads to misunderstanding and invalidation, which then leads to heightened arousal, inaccurate expression, and misunderstanding and invalidation. So this continues over and over, and you can imagine if you're at this heightened level of arousal and you can't express yourself clearly, you can't define problems clearly and solve them. So let's talk for a brief moment about validation and what it is, especially because this has been covered. But it's basically the communication to another person that their thoughts, feelings, and actions make sense and are understandable in a particular situation. And you can actually communicate this understanding even if you don't fully understand the person's experience. Just by asking questions to clarify what they're experiencing at a given moment, we're doing this with the assumption that their experience is legitimate. So it looks like you've had a really rough day at school. Tell me a little bit about what happened. Self-validation involves perceiving your own feelings, thoughts, and actions as accurate and acceptable in a particular situation. So it's understandable that I feel anxious when my daughter didn't come home by the curfew, given the fact that she's run away, and many parents would feel this way if they were in this situation. Okay, this slide is very important. Other people have touched upon this, but the beauty of validation is that you don't have to agree with somebody in order to communicate an understanding of their experience, which can be really helpful when families are in conflict with each other. So what should be validated? Feelings, thoughts, and behaviors in ourselves and in other people. Why? Because it improves relationship and communication. When you respond to your family members' valid or accurate disclosures with validation, you complete the validation cycle. One person accurately expresses something, the other listens, communicates understanding of that other person's experience. So why should we validate? It shows that we are listening, that we understand, that we're being non-judgmental, that we care about the other person and about the relationship, and that conflict and disagreement is possible with decreased intensity. So this is the converse of the cycle that I showed earlier, and both of these are from Rossetti's book. So when you validate your family member's experience, their arousal goes down because of the soothing properties of validation. And when arousal goes down, people accurately or express more, they disclose more to the other person, they become more easy to understand, and then they're more likely to be validated. So you can see in which this cycle leads to decreased emotional arousal and more accurate expression and more effective problem solving. So how do we validate? I'll go through this quickly because I know that other people have covered it. But when we're teaching validation, we want to teach active listening, making eye contact, staying focused, being conscious not only of our verbal reactions, but our nonverbal reactions. I often see body language, looking away, sighing, rolling your eyes, and so forth. Observe what the other person is feeling, and then look for a word to describe that feeling. You seem sad. It's like skillful mind reading. You want to reflect the feeling back without judgment. Show tolerance for the other person. Look for the kernel of truth in their perspective. So if your son or daughter studied hard for an exam and they got a low grade, they may feel frustrated, hopeless, and validating those emotions makes sense and can help to soothe their distress. They also may have urges, though, to smoke pot, and may smoke pot to distract from these emotions. That, on the other hand, as we know, is not a valid behavioral response. So you want to validate the valid and harness your mindfulness skills to make precise choices about what you're going to validate and how you're going to communicate that. You want to respond in a way that shows that you're taking the other person seriously as well. So validation is one end of the dialectic, and we want to balance that treatment strategy with change-oriented strategies, such as problem solving, which I'm going to go to next. And again, as family therapists, and we're teaching parents to do this as well, we're trying to use our mindfulness skills to balance validation strategies and problem solving, acceptance and change. So problem solving with families. This slide, one of the main ideas I want you to take away is that the same problem solving strategies that we use in individual therapy are also all applicable to family therapy. And the first step in problem solving is to define the problem specifically by conducting a behavioral chain analysis. It's to define the problem, yes, I got that right. So following this, therapists are going to create a family behavioral analysis after they do one specifically with the patient and with the parents. You create a family behavioral analysis to understand the transactional nature of the problem behaviors of the parent and the patient that are perpetuating the problem behaviors in the family. The next step is going to be to conduct a solution analysis and decide which skills you're going to use to address the ineffective transactions between the parent and the children that are perpetuating the problematic patterns in the family. And then the effective family therapist will go back to the orientation and commitment strategies, and they will get the families to make the necessary changes to decrease problem behaviors and increase skillful ones. So to illustrate the problem-solving process, I'm going to use a specific example of a problematic transactional pattern that arose in the family. In this transactional pattern, the teens and her parents' behaviors were separate but impacted each other. So before I get to that, I want to explain a little bit more about family behavioral analysis and what behavioral analysis is in general. So when we're talking about behavioral analysis, it's a descriptive, the emphasis is on being descriptive and specific, noticing details about the context in which a problem behavior occurs and the consequences or lack thereof of the behavior that we're addressing. This is referred to as a chain analysis because each step or link that leads to the problem behavior can be identified. So the first step is to select a specific incident, a time and a place, so that you are all discussing the same thing. So in this case, there was a 17-year-old female who was hospitalized for suicidal thoughts and chronic cutting. After her release from the hospital, there were weekly arguments regarding the patient's curfew on weekends. The patient's parents instituted a 10 p.m. curfew, whereas the patient wanted a 12 a.m. curfew, as her friends had. One Friday evening, the patient did not comply with the curfew, resulting in a punishment, which was a prompting event for the problem behaviors on the part of the parents and on the part of the patient. So here I have a behavioral chain analysis for the patient. And what I'd like to do is work from left to right to understand what happened for her. So her vulnerability factors were isolation from friends, bullying from her peers, and failing her classes. The prompting event for the patient was being punished, specifically grounded during homecoming weekend. The links in the chain for her were the thought, I'll never see my friends, I can't take this anymore, and Dad said, you'll be fine, it's only one weekend. So she felt anxious, hopeless, and angry. The teenager's problem behavior was grabbing a knife from the kitchen with her parents present, running to her room, and cutting. The consequences, so what happened after the problem behavior, was that her parents came to the room, her dad yelled and left the house, and her mom slept in the room and made special plans for her for the weekends to try to structure her time and keep her busy. So the parents' behavioral chain, and by the way, I just want to point out that you may do this with both the parents and the patient present, or you might do this separately and then bring them together for the family behavioral chain. And it really depends on the family that you're working with. So the parent behavioral chain, you see that their vulnerability factors were different. They included financial stressors, their daughter's hospitalization, and marital problems. And the prompting event for them was the argument with their daughter. The links for the parents were the thought that on mom's part that she's going back to the hospital, dad had the thought she's manipulating us, and the daughter cut. And their emotions were anxiety and anger. The problem behavior on the part of the parents were parents coming to the room, dad yelling and leaving, and mom sleeping in the room and making special plans for the teenager. The consequences, what came next after the parents' behavior, was a big argument, the daughter breaking curfew the following weekend, and then cutting with greater frequency. Okay, so here we have the family behavioral chain. I'm obviously not going to go through this whole entire chart here, but I just want to point out the transactional nature of the patients and the parents' problems. So if you see the broader statement, you'll be fine, and it's only one weekend, it appears to be a link in the chain that contributed to the patient's cutting. Obviously, it's not the only cause. The patient's problem behavior, in turn, her cutting, was a link in the chain of events that led to her parents' problem behavior, for example, her mom sleeping in her room and making plans. The parents' problem behavior, in turn, appears to contribute to an increased vulnerability for them, meaning more arguing between them, as well as increased frequency of the prompting event, which is arguments over curfew, and increased frequency of their daughter's problem behaviors, that being cutting. So we've got all this information from the chain. And the next step is, what do we do with all of this, which is solution analysis strategies. So the first step is to identify goals, needs, and desires. This is going to be different for the parents and for the teenager. So in this case, parents wanted to increase their daughter's compliance with house rules and her use of distress tolerance skills. The daughter wanted to increase her privileges, obviously her curfew, and improve her relationship with peers. So the next step is to generate solutions as you would in your garden variety problem solving strategy. So you're going to brainstorm. Do we make it curfew later? Do we want to make it earlier? Should we create a list of behavioral skills that will enable the patient to gradually earn a later curfew? Do we want to make a family distress tolerance plan that they can use during arguments? So the next step is to evaluate solutions. What are the pros and cons, for example, of a later curfew? Well, the pros is the patient will be very happy, and that might help her to feel less isolated from her friends. Potential con of this, though, could be reinforcing problem behaviors versus skillful behaviors. The next step is choosing a solution to implement. In this case, the family decided, along with the therapist, to create a list of skills or behavioral targets that will enable the patient to gradually earn a later curfew. And they also decided they needed to make a family distress tolerance plan to use during arguments. So what are each of the family members going to do to bring their distress level down? The last step, which is critical, is troubleshooting the solution. What is going to get in the way? What emotions will get in the way of using your skills? What vulnerability factors will? And then you're going to talk about what skills they're going to use to address pitfalls. Okay, so this is the family solution analysis slide, and there's a whole lot of verbiage on here, so I just want to direct you to looking at the skills in parentheses that I put next to different links in the chain. So where it says thoughts and emotions, that's the same as the links were on the earlier slide. So the daughter had the thought, I'll never see my friends. So in that case, we want to increase her use of dialectical thinking. She felt very invalidated by Dad's statement, you'll be fine. So we want to increase her use of self-validation because we're not always going to be validated by the people in our environment. Mom had the thought she's going back to the hospital, which obviously made her very anxious. We want to also increase Mom's dialectical thinking. And Dad had the thought she's manipulating us, so we want to increase his use of observe and describe skills and validation. You don't always have the opportunity to catch this as early as the links in the chain, and you might have urges to engage in the problem behavior itself. So for the daughter, if she gets further along the chain before she uses her skills and has urges to cut, you want to increase her use of distress tolerance. So her use of self-soothe, distraction, radical acceptance, and pros and cons. For the parents, if they're having urges again to go to the daughter's room or to sleep with her overnight, you want to help them to think dialectically and balance their assessment of safety and risk with behavioral contingencies. So what's going to be reinforcing in this case, or potentially reinforcing of the daughter's problem behavior of cutting? So the bottom line that I wanted to highlight through this talk is that family therapy, in my opinion, is really integral to DBT with adolescents. So all family members have behaviors that, although on their own may not seem problematic, become problematic in transaction with the behaviors of other family members. And family sessions enable therapists to assess, highlight, and intervene around these ineffective transactions that contribute to the team's problem behaviors. And again, by being mindful in the session, we may be able to pick up on certain patterns that are perpetuating these problematic transactions and help the family to apply the skills that they're learning in multifamily skills group to improve their ability to support the teenager and help them to reach their goals. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.